They say blood is thicker than water, but they never tell you how it feels when your own family bolts the door, leaving you to drown in the storm. 18 months ago, I stood on my parents' porch with a massive debt and my shivering 12-year-old son. They just smirked and told me to figure it out. My retaliation was never loud or tearful. It was a dead silent execution that shattered their entire empire. Hello to the wonderful audience of the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. So if you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our dedicated team can pay their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can easily help out by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link down in the description or the pinned comment of this video. My name is Tessa Foster, and I am 34 years old. The rain that night in our wealthy Connecticut suburb was not just cold, it was the kind of freezing, relentless downpour that seeped directly into your bones and washed away every illusion you ever held about love and safety. I stood on the pristine, sweeping driveway of my parents' sprawling estate, shivering uncontrollably. Before me towered the custom solid oak front door of their mansion, a piece of wood that cost thousands of dollars, acting as the only barrier between my 12-year-old son and a dry, safe haven. Just 4 hours earlier, my entire reality had been ripped away. I had been officially locked out of my own home by the bank. My husband, Marcus, had always played the role of a brilliant tech investor, charming everyone at country club dinners and charity galas. But behind my back, he was nothing more than a coward and a thief. Without my knowledge, he had secretly forged my signature and mortgaged every single asset we owned, draining our life savings to throw into a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme. When the federal investigators started circling and the house of cards finally collapsed, Marcus did not stay to protect his family. He packed a single duffel bag in the dead of night and fled the country, leaving me and our boy, Leo, to face the devastating fallout. The creditors took the house, the cars, and the accounts. I was left with absolutely nothing but the soaked clothes on my back and the small hand of my terrified son clutching mine in the dark. Desperate, I had walked miles in the rain to reach the one place I thought would always be a sanctuary. I reached out with a trembling hand and pressed the glowing brass doorbell of my childhood home. I expected shock. I expected my mother, Eleanor, to rush out with warm blankets. I expected my father, Arthur, to usher us inside and immediately summon his lawyers to shield us from the ruin. Instead, when the heavy door finally swung open, no welcoming arms reached out into the storm. My parents stood in the grand foyer, perfectly illuminated by the glittering crystal chandelier above. Beside them stood my older sister, Vanessa. They did not look like a family witnessing a tragedy. They looked like a panel of judges inspecting a disgusting nuisance on their porch. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their arms crossed defensively over their expensive cashmere sweaters, staring at me and my shivering son with undisguised contempt. The warm air from the foyer spilled out into the cold night, carrying the rich, heavy scent of roasted duck and an expensive vintage wine. Vanessa took a leisurely sip from her crystal glass, her lips curling into a cruel, mocking smirk. "You have got to be kidding me, Tessa," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "We are in the middle of a private wine tasting with the board members. You are tracking mud onto the imported marble, and frankly, you are ruining the entire evening." I tightened my grip on Leo's hand, my voice cracking as I begged, "Vanessa, please. Marcus took everything. The bank locked us out. We have nowhere to go. We just need a place to sleep tonight, just for Leo." Vanessa rolled her eyes, leaning lazily against the doorframe. "Maybe this is exactly what you need. Consider this a proper lesson for choosing the wrong husband and playing the useless, naive housewife. If you want to learn how to grow up and face the real world, I suggest you take the boy down to the homeless shelter in the city. I hear they hand out free soup and cots." I turned my desperate eyes to my mother, silently pleading for a shred of maternal instinct, but Eleanor merely looked away, her face blank as she smoothed imaginary wrinkles from her designer silk skirt. It was my father, Arthur, who finally stepped forward. His face was a mask of solid stone. He had built his massive real estate empire on utter ruthlessness, and I realized in that moment he was applying that same cutthroat business model to his own daughter. "I am not throwing a single cent into this black hole you created," Arthur declared bluntly, his voice booming harshly over the sound of the pouring rain. "If the press or my investors find out the Foster family is tied to a federal fraud investigation, it will tank our stock and ruin the reputation of my company. You made your bed, Tessa. Now go sleep in it." "Dad, please, look at Leo," I pleaded, gesturing frantically to my son, whose lips were turning a frightening shade of blue. "He is 12 years old. He is your grandson." "He is Marcus's problem," Arthur snapped coldly. Without another word, without a second glance at the child shivering on his doorstep, Arthur stepped back and slammed the heavy oak door shut. The loud thud of the deadbolt locking echoed sharply through the quiet porch. A second later, the porch lights flicked off, plunging us into total darkness. The rain continued to batter us mercilessly, but the freezing water was nothing compared to the absolute ice that suddenly crystallized in my veins. I dropped to my knees on the wet stone, pulling Leo tightly into my chest. He buried his face in my neck, shaking violently, his tiny hands gripping my wet jacket. I did not cry. Not a single tear fell from my eyes. The naive, hopeful woman who would have cried died right there on that porch, murdered by the very people who brought her into the world. I stared straight through the darkness at the tiny sliver of warm light bleeding out from beneath the closed door. I held my son close, and in the freezing, deafening silence of that Connecticut night, I made a toxic, unbreakable vow. Just wait and see what I will do to this Foster name. We managed to salvage my old, beaten-up sedan from a friend's driveway, just hours before the creditors could find it and tow it away. For 14 agonizing nights, that cramped, rust-stained metal box parked in the far, unlit corner of a 24-hour supermarket parking lot became our entire universe. The Northeast winter was utterly unforgiving that year. The nighttime temperatures routinely plummeted far below freezing, turning the inside of the car windows into a thick, opaque layer of solid frost. We had exactly 2 thin fleece blankets to our name. I wrapped them both securely around my son, while I wore 3 layers of whatever mismatched clothes I had managed to grab, keeping my hands tightly stuffed into my armpits to prevent frostbite. Sleep was never truly rest. It was a constant, exhausting state of hypervigilance. Every single time a pair of headlights swept across the cracked windshield, my heart hammered violently against my ribs. The local police cruisers patrolled the massive asphalt lot regularly. Whenever they drove slowly past our row, I would softly push Leo down below the window line and hold my breath until my lungs burned, terrified that a sharp knock on the glass would mean Child Protective Services dragging my boy away from me. I absolutely refused to let Leo become a visible victim of our brutal circumstance to the outside world, and especially to his middle school teachers and classmates. He had to remain a perfectly normal 7th grade student. Achieving that flawless illusion required a grueling, degrading daily routine. Every single morning at precisely 4 o'clock, long before the sun even thought about rising, I would gently wake him up. We would slip out of the freezing car, our breath pluming in the icy air, and quietly walk into the glaring, harsh fluorescent lights of a nearby public park restroom. The smell of cheap industrial bleach mixed with damp concrete always hit my stomach hard. The water from the metal sink tap was like liquid ice. I would strip down to the freezing tile and scrub myself clean as fast as humanly possible using a cheap bar of soap, shivering so violently that my teeth rattled in my skull. Then, it was Leo's turn. I made a quiet game of it, trying to keep his spirits elevated while I fiercely scrubbed dirt and grime out of his school uniform in that filthy porcelain basin. We spent an entire hour taking turns standing under the roaring hot air of the wall-mounted hand dryer, desperately trying to get our damp clothes dry enough so he would not catch severe pneumonia. I meticulously combed his hair, made sure his worn-out shoes were wiped perfectly clean of parking lot mud, and sent him onto the yellow school bus with his chin held high. No one at that school ever suspected that their bright, polite student had spent the night curled up in the back seat of a freezing car. The physical toll of our reality began to relentlessly gnaw at me by the fifth day. We had exactly $42.50 left to our name. Every single penny had to be stretched to its absolute breaking point. Proper nutrition quickly became a luxury we could not even dream to afford. I would walk the long aisles of the supermarket, hunting strictly for damaged goods or items that were heavily discounted because they were a day past their expiration date. When dinner time came around, I would buy a small portion of warm rotisserie chicken or a decent, fresh turkey sandwich for Leo. He was a growing boy. He needed solid protein and calories to stay awake and focus in class. He would look at me, holding out half of his sandwich, and ask why I was not eating with him. I would smile brightly, pointing to an empty wrapper of cheap, stale crackers I had scavenged earlier, and lie straight through my teeth, telling him I had eaten a massive lunch while he was at school, and I was completely stuffed. The absolute truth was that my stomach constantly cramped with a sharp, echoing ache. My clothes began to hang loosely off my shrinking frame, and my vision would occasionally blur from the sheer lack of basic sustenance, but I forcefully swallowed the hunger down. A mother's starvation is a silent, necessary currency paid willingly to keep her child thriving. It was during one of those desperately long, sleepless nights, trying to conserve the car battery while Leo slept, that I made the painful mistake of turning on my cracked cell phone. I was merely trying to find an open wireless internet network, but the browser automatically refreshed my social media feed instead. Right at the top of the glowing screen was a newly uploaded photo album from my older sister, Vanessa. The location tag proudly declared a 5-star luxury ski resort in Aspen, Colorado. There she was, wrapped in a plush, designer white fur coat, holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne in front of a roaring, massive stone fireplace. The caption read, "Skiing in the fresh powder and sipping vintage bubbles. Daddy really knows how to spoil his girls this winter season." The sheer, brazen cruelty of that image struck me directly in the chest like a physical blow. The thousands of dollars funding that extravagant vacation, the money paying for that single glass of champagne, was the exact same wealth my father vehemently claimed he could not spare to keep his own 12-year-old grandson out of a freezing parking lot. They were cheerfully toasting to the good life while we were literally freezing in the dark, surviving on scraps. A bitter, metallic taste of betrayal flooded my mouth. But the emotion that followed was not defeat. It was absolute, unadulterated, cold-blooded rage. That intense rage instantly became my unlimited fuel. I could no longer afford to wallow in despair. Despair was a weak emotion reserved for people who had a safety net to fall back on. I quietly popped the trunk of the sedan and dug out my old, heavy laptop from beneath a pile of discarded clothes. It was a bulky relic from a decade ago, back when I was a highly sought-after, top-tier software engineer, long before Marcus manipulated me into quitting my thriving career to play the role of his supportive, invisible housewife. The ancient battery barely held a charge for more than an hour, so I had to be incredibly strategic. I drove the car to a parking spot directly under a bright, glaring yellow street lamp. I angled the dusty screen to catch the outside light, connected to a weak, unsecured signal radiating from a diner across the street, and opened a blank coding environment. I forced my exhausted, starving brain to aggressively remember. I typed out complex algorithms, reviewing dense coding languages and architectural frameworks that had evolved over the last 10 years. Painstakingly retraining my stiff fingers to fly accurately across the keyboard. I studied advanced system architectures and modern cybersecurity patches until my eyes burned fiercely and the glowing letters blurred together into a chaotic mess. I was undeniably rusty, but the sharp, analytical logic was still perfectly intact, buried alive under years of domestic submission. Every single line of code I wrote under that flickering street lamp was a heavy brick laid in the foundation of my impending revenge. The absolute lowest point of our ordeal arrived on the 14th night. A massive winter storm unexpectedly hit the coast, dropping several inches of heavy snow and violently plunging the temperature down into the single digits. The cold inside the car was agonizing. The vehicle felt exactly like a steel coffin. I wrapped both of my arms tightly around Leo, pressing my entire body against his small frame to share every single ounce of body heat I had left, silently praying to a God I no longer believed in that we would survive until dawn. A profound, crushing sense of failure suddenly washed over me. I had failed to protect him from his father's crimes, and I had completely failed to provide him with a safe, warm home. A single treacherous tear finally betrayed my stoic facade, slipping hotly down my freezing cheek and landing softly on his forehead. Leo stirred in the dark. He did not cry. He looked up at me with tired eyes that had seen way too much misery for a child his age. He reached out from beneath the thin, worn blankets and firmly gripped my freezing hand with surprising strength. "You do not need them, Mom," he whispered, his young voice incredibly steady and fiercely determined in the pitch-black car. "I only need you." In that freezing, dark space, completely surrounded by ice and familial betrayal, his words were the exact spark needed to ignite a massive inferno within my soul. My son was not broken, and neither was I. We were going to survive this nightmare, and the second we did, I was going to systematically tear the world apart to hand him the absolute kingdom he deserved. The turning point finally arrived after 3 agonizing weeks on the streets. I managed to secure a low-level, entry position at the data processing department of AeroShift Dynamics. It was a massive logistics software corporation, but despite its gleaming glass exterior, the company was secretly bleeding out from the inside. The salary they offered was barely above minimum wage, barely enough to move Leo and myself into a cheap, weekly rate motel. But it was a crucial foot in the door. More importantly, it gave me direct access to a corporate server. AeroShift was teetering on the absolute brink of a catastrophic systemic crisis. Their proprietary software, relied upon by hundreds of global shipping conglomerates, was experiencing devastating daily crashes, and nobody knew why. Instead of just keeping my head down and mindlessly inputting data for 8 hours a day, I took a massive risk. I secretly utilized every single second of my allotted lunch breaks to quietly dig into the failing back-end architecture. While the highly paid senior engineers were busy panicking in their corner offices and pointing fingers at each other, I sat completely unnoticed in my cramped, windowless cubicle, meticulously analyzing the failing core system. It took me 3 relentless days of skipping meals to pinpoint the exact massive, gaping hole in their code. It was an incredibly complex memory leak hidden deep within the legacy framework, a fatal flaw that the arrogant executives were completely blind to. The ultimate climax of their crisis exploded on a random Tuesday morning. The chief executive officer, Richard Sterling, called a frantic, mandatory emergency meeting for the entire company in the main auditorium. The servers had crashed globally yet again. A major international shipping client was threatening to file a lawsuit worth tens of millions of dollars if the system was not fully restored within 24 hours. The head of engineering stood at the front of the room, sweating profusely under the bright lights, nervously admitting they needed at least 2 weeks to locate the bug and rewrite a patch. A heavy, terrifying silence fell over the room as the reality of bankruptcy loomed over the corporation. That was my moment. I stood up from the very back row of the crowded auditorium, tightly gripping a small silver drive in my hand. I walked straight down the center aisle, completely ignoring the confused, judgmental stares of the upper management. I did not ask for permission to speak. I walked right past the stunned head of engineering, plugged my drive directly into the main presentation laptop, and projected my code onto the massive screen behind him. I took a deep breath and calmly explained exactly where the critical security flaw was located and how it was bottlenecking their entire global network. I then confidently informed the silent room that the custom patch I had written by myself overnight would permanently stabilize the system in under 15 minutes. The room remained dead silent as the senior developers frantically reviewed my code. Their faces turned pale as they realized a low-level data clerk had just solved a multi-million-dollar crisis they could not even comprehend. My patch executed flawlessly, the servers stabilized immediately, the client dropped the threats, and the devastating lawsuit was instantly averted. Richard Sterling did not just thank me, he immediately ordered me up to his private penthouse office. By the end of that afternoon, I was no longer a struggling mother living on minimum wage. The chief executive officer bypassed every standard corporate protocol and promoted me directly to the position of Director of Systems Architecture. He handed me a high six-figure salary, a massive signing bonus, and substantial company stock options. The very first thing I did with my advance was pull my son out of that miserable motel. I moved Leo and myself into a breathtaking, high-security luxury apartment in the heart of the financial district. It featured 24-hour concierge service, private elevator access, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. When Leo walked into his own massive bedroom and touched the clean, warm sheets, the relief in his eyes washed away the last remnants of my exhaustion. We finally had a real home, an impenetrable fortress where no one could ever hurt us again. I had successfully established a completely new identity, wielding true corporate power and total financial autonomy. But I was far from finished. The fire in my chest had not burned out. It had only grown colder and infinitely more focused. With my new wealth and absolute stability, I quietly reached out to the most ruthless, elite legal firm in the city. I sat down with a team of high-powered corporate lawyers and gave them a single, undeniable mandate. We were going to weave an airtight, inescapable legal net, one that would systematically drag the ghosts of my past straight into the light and resolve every single remnant of their betrayal. Marcus thought he could just vanish with our money, and my family thought they could just discard me in the rain. They were all about to learn a very hard lesson. Greed has an incredibly predictable scent. It did not take long for the whispers of my sudden rise at Aeroshift Dynamics to echo across the Atlantic and reach the ears of the man who had abandoned us. 6 months after he fled in the dead of night, Marcus strutted back onto American soil. He had heard the lucrative rumors about my massive signing bonus and my high six-figure salary. Armed with a perfectly tailored Italian suit and a thoroughly rehearsed mask of deep remorse, he booked a flight back to claim what he believed was rightfully his. On paper, we were technically still legally married, and in his arrogant, calculating mind, that meant he was legally entitled to 50% of every single dollar I had bled to earn. What Marcus fundamentally failed to understand was that the frightened, naive housewife he left behind in that torrential rainstorm was completely dead. I had anticipated his return from the exact second my first paycheck cleared. While he was hiding out in a cheap resort abroad, my elite legal team had been working around the clock. We had cast an invisible, inescapable net, meticulously tracking his digital footprint and piecing together the chaotic trail of his illegal cryptocurrency transactions. He walked directly into a lethal trap that had been waiting patiently for him to arrive. I agreed to meet him at the towering glass and steel headquarters of my law firm. The massive conference room was located on the 60th floor, featuring a sprawling mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. I sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 of the most ruthless corporate litigators in the state. When Marcus confidently pushed open the heavy glass doors, he immediately launched into his rehearsed performance. He tried to force a sorrowful, watery smile, taking a tentative step forward with his arms slightly open. He spoke in a soft, sickeningly sweet tone, claiming he had made a terrible, desperate mistake, that he had fled out of sheer panic, and that he only came back because he could not bear to live another day without his beloved wife and son. When I did not even blink, his smile faltered, his tone shifted into something slightly more menacing, casually dropping the reminder that since there was no divorce decree, our assets were still joint property under state law. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a tear. I simply reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out a dense, 300-page binder, and tossed it forcefully onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed sharply in the silent room. My lead attorney leaned forward and began to calmly narrate the contents of that binder. We had every single piece of evidence regarding his federal financial fraud. We had the forged bank signatures, the traced offshore wire transfers, the exact IP addresses he used to drain our accounts, and the damning email chains proving his deliberate intent to defraud both me and his investors. The confident color violently drained from Marcus's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. I folded my hands and delivered my absolute ultimatum. I told him he had exactly two choices. Choice number one was to pick up the expensive gold pen resting on the table and sign the stack of legal documents sitting next to the binder. Those documents stipulated a complete, uncontested divorce, the absolute surrender of all financial claims to my estate, and the permanent relinquishment of all parental rights to Leo. Choice number two was to walk out the door, at which point my lawyers would instantly forward the entire binder directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, guaranteeing him a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The silence that followed was deeply, immensely satisfying. The arrogant facade completely shattered. Marcus began to shake violently. He stared at the damning evidence, then at my cold, unwavering eyes, realizing I would genuinely enjoy watching him rot behind bars, trembling, sweating profusely, and completely broken. He picked up the pen and signed every single page. He surrendered everything. He slinked out of that conference room utterly defeated, permanently eradicated from our lives, without securing a single cent of my wealth. The very next morning, I stood before a judge and officially legally changed my son's last name, washing away the final, filthy stain of his father's existence. With Marcus permanently neutralized, I finalized the cash purchase of a breathtaking, multi-million-dollar estate in the most exclusive, heavily guarded upper-class neighborhood in the state. I was no longer an outcast or a victim. I had officially claimed my rightful seat at the table of power, and I was finally ready to turn my full, undivided attention to the Foster family. Karma rarely announces its arrival with trumpets. It prefers to creep in quietly, slipping through the cracks of arrogance until the entire foundation collapses. Roughly a year after I had secured my position and my peace, the commercial real estate market experienced a sudden, violent contraction. My father had spent decades building his massive empire on a dangerous mountain of over-leveraged loans and aggressive expansion. When a massive bad debt scandal surrounding his firm finally leaked to the financial press, the market reacted without a single shred of mercy. Overnight, the stock of the Foster family enterprise plummeted by over 70%. It is deeply poetic how quickly the mighty can fall when their safety nets are completely woven from borrowed money. Within weeks, the aggressive banks began calling in their massive loans, the custom-built Connecticut mansion with the solid oak door. The very same door that had been slammed in my freezing child's face was aggressively foreclosed upon. The irony was almost too rich to digest. My older sister, Vanessa, who had spent her entire adult life banking entirely on her elite social status, was unceremoniously dumped by her wealthy fiancé the very moment news of their impending bankruptcy hit the country club circuits. In a matter of mere days, the untouchable Foster family found themselves completely stripped of their assets, staring down the exact same terrifying barrel of homelessness they had so casually recommended to me. Desperation is a powerful, blinding motivator, and it forced my father into a frantic corner. His entire remaining company hinged entirely on securing a highly coveted plot of commercial land in the city center. Developing that prime real estate was the absolute last lifeline capable of satisfying his furious creditors and preventing total liquidation. He scrambled to assemble a final, desperate bid, only to discover that the land had already been aggressively acquired in a closed-door deal by a major tech conglomerate looking to build a new regional headquarters. That conglomerate was Aeroshift Dynamics, and the chief executive assigned to directly handle the development and potential resale of that exact plot was none other than their newly appointed Director of Systems Architecture. The realization must have hit them like a runaway freight train. For days, my private office phone remained completely silent as they presumably choked on their own pride. But hunger and ruin always conquer ego. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon, while I was reviewing architectural blueprints in my penthouse office, my private line buzzed. I pressed the flashing button and heard a voice I had not heard since that torrential rainstorm. "Tessa, my darling." My mother, Eleanor, cooed through the high-definition speaker. Her tone was sickeningly sweet, dripping with a manufactured warmth that completely ignored the brutal reality of our last encounter. She spoke as if we were just catching up after a brief, pleasant weekend apart. "Hello, Mother," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even and thoroughly professional. "We heard the wonderful news about your massive promotion at AeroShift," she continued, her voice trembling just slightly with barely concealed desperation. "Your father and I are just so incredibly proud of you. We always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. Listen, sweetheart, the family is going through a tiny rough patch right now. The market has been so terribly unfair to your father. We saw that your company holds the deed to the downtown sector. We were hoping, since family always takes care of family, that you might be able to pull some strings, just to help us secure the land and save the family legacy." She actually had the unmitigated audacity to use the word family. 18 months ago, that word would have triggered a tidal wave of devastating grief. Now, it just sounded like a cheap, desperate negotiation tactic. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and looked out the massive window at the sprawling city far below. I did not scream. I did not curse her or remind her of the night she let her own grandson freeze in a supermarket parking lot. Instead, I let out a soft, gentle laugh. "Of course, Mother," I said smoothly, injecting just enough fabricated warmth into my voice to make her completely believe her blatant manipulation was working. "I completely understand the situation. I will have my assistant arrange an official meeting for us at the AeroShift headquarters this Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning. Bring Father and Vanessa. We can discuss the transfer of the property then." "Oh, thank you, Tessa. I knew you would understand. We love you so much," she gushed, the overwhelming relief palpable in her breathless voice before the line clicked dead. I placed the receiver down gently on the glass desk. They genuinely believed I was still the soft, desperate girl craving their approval, completely ready to hand over the keys to their salvation just to earn a pathetic pat on the head. My utter silence regarding the past had given them the dangerous illusion of absolute safety. They were going to walk into my building expecting a tearful reunion and a lucrative, saving contract. I spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously drafting the final documents for our meeting, ensuring every single legal clause was a perfectly polished nail for their corporate coffin. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and bright sunshine. At precisely 10 o'clock, the Foster family walked through the grand revolving doors of the AeroShift Dynamics headquarters. They were immediately escorted by security into the private elevator and brought all the way up to the main executive boardroom on the 40th floor. I stood silently inside my private office, watching them through the tinted glass partition. They had dressed in their absolute finest clothes, making a desperate and pathetic attempt to project the immense wealth and elite status they no longer possessed. Arthur wore a custom navy suit, though the collar now hung noticeably loose around his stress-thinned neck. Eleanor tightly clutched a vintage designer handbag like a sinking woman holding on to a life preserver. Vanessa wore an extravagant silk dress, a piece she had undoubtedly hidden from the ruthless bankruptcy liquidators. They sat nervously around the massive mahogany conference table, their eyes darting around the opulent room. They were completely convinced they were about to experience a tearful, heartwarming family reunion that would end with me writing a massive corporate bailout check. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and confidently stepped into the boardroom. I was no longer the soaked, shivering, and desperate girl pleading on their porch. I wore a sharp, tailored charcoal power suit. My posture was perfectly straight, and my expression was a cold, unreadable mask of absolute authority. The moment I entered, Eleanor immediately shot up from her leather chair. She stretched her arms incredibly wide. A massive, fabricated smile plastered across her face, fully expecting a loving maternal embrace. I did not even break my stride. I walked right past her outstretched arms without a single glance, took my rightful seat at the absolute head of the table, and placed a slim manila folder perfectly in the center of the polished wood. Eleanor slowly lowered her arms, her fake smile completely shattering as she awkwardly sat back down. Arthur cleared his throat, desperately trying to summon his old, booming executive voice. He immediately started rambling about the downtown commercial land plot, aggressively insisting that family always takes care of family, and explaining how my corporate influence could easily save the Foster legacy. I let him speak to the room for exactly 2 minutes. Then, I raised my right hand, silencing his speech instantly. I looked directly into my father's eyes and slid the manila folder across the smooth mahogany until it rested directly in front of him. I kept my voice perfectly even and thoroughly professional. I clearly informed him that there would be no joint venture, no family discount, and absolutely no bailout. Inside that folder was a legally binding acquisition contract. AeroShift Dynamics was offering to aggressively buy out his entire failing enterprise. Arthur eagerly flipped open the folder, his eyes rapidly scanning down to the bottom line of the contract. Within a fraction of a second, all the blood violently drained from his face. The purchase price I had authorized was an absolute insult. It was calculated down to the exact penny, offering just enough money to completely cover his massive outstanding federal loans so he would not rot in a federal prison. However, it left him with absolutely zero equity. There was not a single cent of profit. He would walk away completely and utterly wiped out. Arthur slammed his fist violently onto the mahogany table, his face turning a dangerous, explosive shade of crimson. He aggressively shouted that it was highway robbery, declaring he would never sign away his life's work for mere pennies. Beside him, Vanessa suddenly broke. The polished, arrogant sister who had mocked me from the warmth of her foyer burst into loud, ugly, hysterical tears. She leaned wildly across the table, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark streaks, screaming and begging for my mercy. She cried uncontrollably, frantically reminding me that we shared the same blood, that we were a family, and that I could not possibly be so cruel as to leave them with absolutely nothing to their name. I slowly stood up from my leather executive chair. The massive boardroom instantly fell dead silent as my sharp, unwavering gaze locked onto them. I looked at Arthur, then at Eleanor, and finally at the weeping Vanessa. My voice was chillingly steady, carrying the heavy weight of absolute finality. I looked right into their terrified eyes and calmly repeated the exact words they had carved into my soul 18 months ago. Figure it out. Consider this a proper lesson for your extraordinarily poor financial management. Right at that exact moment, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. Leo walked into the room. He was no longer the terrified, freezing 12-year-old boy clutching my jacket in the rain. He was a tall, incredibly confident teenager, dressed impeccably in his elite private school uniform. He carried a warm cup of artisan coffee in his hands. He walked straight up to my side, gently placed the cup on the table, and smiled brightly at me. He did not even cast a single glance at the 3 shattered people sitting across the table. To my son, they were nothing more than invisible, irrelevant strangers. By completely ignoring the people who called themselves his grandparents and his aunt, he beautifully proved that our real family consisted solely of the 2 of us. He kissed my cheek, softly told me he would be waiting in my office, and quietly left the room. The sheer, undeniable power of that interaction completely broke whatever pathetic resistance Arthur had left in his body. With trembling, defeated hands, my father pulled a pen from his jacket pocket and signed his name on every single page of the acquisition papers, officially signing away his entire empire. Without saying another word to them, I reached over and pressed the silver intercom button on my desk, calmly instructing my security team to immediately escort our guests out of the building. I did not stay in the room to watch them weep over the signed documents. I walked back into my private office, closed the door, and stood before the massive glass window overlooking the entire city, 40 stories below. I silently watched the three tiny figures of the Foster family being unceremoniously escorted out onto the crowded, unforgiving street. They stood awkwardly on the pavement, looking completely lost, entirely broken, and utterly stripped of their power, slowly blending into the vast sea of ordinary pedestrians. They had absolutely nothing left. I took a slow, deep sip of my warm coffee and smiled softly. My new life was finally, perfectly complete. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to my story today. I would really love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please let me know by leaving a comment down below. If you thought today's story was great and you want to help our channel survive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code right on your screen, or by clicking the donation link found in the video description or the pinned comment. Your generous support is exactly what provides our hardworking team with a salary, helping them feed their families and allowing them to continue creating more amazing stories for you all. Thank you again, and have a beautiful day.